Hello and welcome to my PowerPoint presentation on the Vietnam War. My name is Anthony Lister. Let's get started. So here's just a brief overview of the topics we will be covering in this PowerPoint. We'll be going over the state of Vietnam at the time, a little before the war and before the US enters it. We'll go over early American support in the beginning of the war, leading up to it, and more on us actually entering the war, and a little on the more political side of anti-war America and ending the war. So the state of Vietnam at the time, it was in a civil war. Vietnam was divided between the Communist North and the Democratic South. The US aligned itself with the Democratic Southern leader Ngo Dinh Diem because we wanted to stop the spread of potential communism from the North, who was led by Ho Chi Minh. In the South, the National Liberation Force formed to align itself with Ho Chi Minh, and they operated within the South, fighting on the front lines basically, who they eventually also joined up with the main forces that Ho Chi Minh controlled in the North. The NLF was also known to us as the Viet Cong. So early American support in the beginning of the war. John F. Kennedy was the president at the time. He sent initially less than 1,000 troops. This escalated within the next few months to 16,000 troops and military advisors to help the Southern forces kind of get back on their feet. Later into the war, Diem was assassinated, which kind of toppled the Southern government, basically, and kind of threw it for disarray. The reason this assassination happened was because the US saw that he was losing power and he was losing his foothold and his ideals were also changing, and the US didn't want that. So the CIA and FBI funded a group of militants in the South among the army basically to assassinate Diem, which we still helped the South, but we just didn't want Diem in power because he was getting too uncontrollable. And JFK was also assassinated in that year as well. So Lyndon B. Johnson took over, who was his vice president at the time. He sent in more troops and advisors in the next coming months. And in the Gulf of Tonkin, the Viet Cong attacked US boats with submarines and torpedoes, and Congress saw this as an act of aggression against America, obviously, and they passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which we'll cover on the next page as well. With this resolution, this was us formally entering the war, basically. We never really signed a declaration of war, but this was more of an unofficial declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin stated that the president should take all necessary measures to prevent, further aggression against US forces. So we began in the war systematically bombing the Vietnamese, but there was an issue with this. We had no clear targets. There were some above ground factories and bases that we could hit, but there was never really a clear large base or large factory that we could shut down. This was in part that the Vietnamese created these tunnel networks, which actually housed all their factories, their barracks, kitchen, everything that just troops needed. And you can see over at the picture on the right, there's actually a man in one of those tunnels. You see how small it is. It's truly amazing that they actually built all these tunnel networks to hide from US bombers. So we were sending all these bombers out there with no real target, and we weren't really doing any direct damage to them. Johnson also believed that this would be a war of attrition, that we would be able to overpower the enemy, but this was not the case. The NLF saw this as their war for independence and to prove themselves as a nation. And eventually the US just kept throwing more and more forces, and nothing was really working. We never really saw any true gain. And back at home, the people were seeing this as well. We were seeing we were throwing all our forces out for no apparent reason, it seemed. We weren't really gaining anything. And the Tet Offensive was one of the more major battles. In this offensive, we lost, I believe it was Kuchi, and the city of Hue fell. And we actually have videos and photographs of these events as well, where we see NLF forces dragging out and killing civilians and unarmed troops and prisoners, and it was just a massacre. And we could see all this back at home. This is when people really started to oppose the war, along with obviously the draft and sending more and more troops over every day, it seemed. With the incoming 1968 election, Americans truly began to oppose the war in Vietnam. They saw no apparent gain and just intense losses on foreign soil. That is when American students started to oppose it, with Senator J. William Fulbright leading the opposition and bringing the fight to Congress. Nixon soon campaigned off that, and his whole platform was off restoring stability and peace with honor. He wanted to make peace with the Vietnamese people, but that never fell through. Henry Kissinger tried to meet with the North Vietnamese quite a few times to negotiate with them, but these always fell through and led to more fighting. So the aftermath of the war, in the closing days of the war, Saigon had fallen to North Vietnamese forces in 1975, which is also when all US forces withdrew from the country of Vietnam. And later in 1976, Vietnam would unite under socialism, but this is where I chose to stop the presentation as it marked the end of US involvement. This is just my works cited page. I thank you for your time and listening to my presentation.